Welcome to Restoring Faith in Government. Why enshrining government transparency and accountability into law are solutions that matter. In 2022, for the first time, the Global State of Democracy report listed the United States as a democracy in decline. The report states the US, and I quote, fell victim to authoritarian tendencies. A December 2023 Gallup poll found that only 28% of US adults are satisfied with the way democracy is working in our country. That's a new low. Illinois too needs reform. Illinois has weathered some high-profile corruption scandals over the years. In 2020, the state's history of corruption was a partial factor in the defeat of the graduated income tax amendment, a fiscal policy reform the League has supported for over 50 years. As defenders of democracy, the League of Women Voters of Illinois is pleased to introduce you to the Democracy Solutions Project. This project is a partnership between the University of Chicago's Center for Effective Government and Chicago Public Media. Our speaker today is Dave McKinney of Chicago Public Media, a not-for-profit radio and print media company. Mr. McKinney currently serves, Mr. McKinney currently serves as state's politics reporter at WBEZ, which is Chicago's NPR news source. He has an impressive background. Mr. McKinney spent 19 years as the Chicago Sun-Times Springfield bureau chief with additional posts at Reuters and the Daily Herald. His work has been published in Crane Chicago Business, the New York Times, and Chicago Magazine. In 2014, Mr. McKinney was named one of the country's best state house reporters by the Washington Post. As you can see, he's won numerous awards. In addition, Mr. McKinney hosted the Public Official A podcast, Blagojevich, and has appeared on CNN's United States of Scandal. Please give a warm welcome to Dave McKinney.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Donna, and thanks for having me, everyone. It's great to see a full room of people here, and I was just the way our democracy has been going lately. It's just nice to see folks here who are invested in making things better. I don't need to say this, but I just think it's important to just sort of step back and think about democracy for a minute and the freedoms that we have. We just all sort of assume they're always going to be there, but they're not. And that's what our dilemma is right now. We can speak our mind when we want to. We can confront authority. We can protest. We get a vote in open elections. We have a free press. And those are things that dictators, whom we have no business befriending, don't want to see. And it's so easy to slide into that. So during my career, I've become a student of government. And I didn't set out to be that way because I think, like a lot of people, you go through middle school when you take your Constitution test and your eyes glaze over and think, how on earth is this going to affect me? And having been in the State House for as long as I was, it was just fascinating watching all of the things that happened in that building. We tend to focus, and this session dealing with corruption is kind of the ugly underbelly of government, obviously, but there are a lot of good things that government does. I think back in my career down there, I met Barack Obama when he was a state senator, and I followed his career as it went on that steep climb to the presidency. Just to think that, to have that kind of interaction with someone like that was a career highlight. But I also think about the things that happened there on my watch. I think about the abolition of the death penalty. I think about the legalization of gay marriage. I think about watching the impeachment of a governor. I think about being here and watching the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those are all things that are just things that the government got right, I think. I've just a little more history about my time there. I was adding it up the other day. I've either covered or interviewed 9 of our governors, which that makes me kind of old, I guess. But that goes all the way back to Bill Stratton. He was a delegate in the San Diego Convention in 1996, the Republican Convention, and he was an old man at that point. But I did a little profile on him for the Sun-Times then, and every governor since then. And I mean, some of them I've clashed with, some of them I've had, good relations with. I mean, some of them today will call me up, and it's just like random phone calls. And so, I've watched these people function. But I will tell you, one of the journalistic truisms that I have discovered in my time there is that if you want to cover politics in Illinois, you also have to have a background in criminal justice. And that brings us to today's topic of public corruption. Let me go over some of the topics here that I want to cover. On the slide there, you can read them, but I spent time looking at corruption by the numbers. I want to reflect a little bit on 2023. It was a real watershed year in terms of corruption in Illinois. I'll tell you a little bit about a key Supreme Court case to be watching that relates to all of this. I did some digging, and there, we know corruption's bad, but there are actual costs to it. I did a little analysis on corruption and voting patterns. I think it's natural to want to talk a little bit about the condition of the fourth estate, the press, because reporters are vital in uncovering corruption. We'll talk a little bit about the innovative changes that have occurred in Illinois' media landscape. Talk some about the Democracy Solution Project, philanthropic efforts to defend democracy, and the Center for Effective Government. So when you talk about public corruption in Illinois, you may think, if you like movies or history, you may think about Al Capone, paying off city officials in the 1920s, or more recently, you might think about Operation Greylord back in the 1980s when Cook County judges were on the take. Or you might think about 4 of the past 11 governors who have gone to federal prison in Illinois. I mean, it's a continuing punchline, but it's a serious problem, and it's nice to see that we've gotten a little bit of stability here of late. That I don't feel that at least in our government that it's quite as bad as it was. I mean, the courts are telling us a different story though. But I pulled together data from the Department of Justice. They compile public corruption convictions, and this graphic here, you can kind of see the up and down nature of it over the last 10 years. But it's a thing that is ever present. And I would say that there's been sort of a slight increase here in 23 and 24 with these convictions. Excuse me, a lot of these cases are going through the federal building in the Dirksen downtown. And I've spent a fair amount of time sitting in courtrooms there. And that's the place, honestly, I've thought about like my retirement plans and think, I could actually see myself going and sitting and watching these trials, because if you haven't done it, you really ought to do it. And even if like you're, if you're not close to Chicago, and that's a bit of an effort, go to your county courthouse and watch trials there, because, watching how our system works, watching how the judges are, looking at their temperaments, the prosecutors, it's just fascinating to me. And so one of the biggest trials last year that I was part of, I covered the whole thing, going down every day, was the Commonwealth Edison trial. There were 4 former executives and lobbyists who were convicted of conspiring to bribe former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. And it was a blockbuster case that involved the playing of more than 100 secret government recordings. These recordings showed jurors firsthand how our government worked out of public view. The utility's former CEO, Ann Pramaggiore, once one of Chicago's most prominent business leaders, by far probably the most powerful female business executive in Chicago. She was convicted, as was Madigan's close confidant, Michael McLean, and former company lobbyists Jay Doherty and John Hooker. A jury concluded that these 4 people engaged in a scheme that revolved around showering favors on Madigan, and that included more than $1 million worth of no work ComEd contracts that went to key players in Madigan's political organization. And it happened over nearly a decade in time, and it was out of public view. And it came as ComEd added billions of dollars to its bottom line as a result of legislation that Madigan helped pass. So let's do a quick refresher on Madigan. I mean, I think everybody in the room knows Michael Madigan. We've all had experience reading stories about him. I mean, I had so many interactions with him when I was in Springfield. I mean, he was, you know, a lot of times we thought of him as the speaker who didn't speak, because you never really kind of knew much about what was going on in his brain. But that was a strategic decision on his part. He wanted to keep his adversaries in the dark, and it helped him maintain power. You think back on his career, he was speaker for all but 2 years for nearly a 40-year cycle. He was forced out as a result of the ComEd bribery scheme, but no legislation, big or small, could pass without his involvement. And he made a career of tying governors in both parties in pretzels. The other thing that I think about Madigan, I mean, his first year in office was 1971, and you know, I'm approaching 60 years old, and that was my first. That was the year I entered first grade. I mean, that just gives you the idea, the duration of this guy. Right now, he's facing 23 counts of racketeering, bribery, conspiracy, and they relate to the ComEd case, some other misconduct, including the alleged illegal soliciting of business for his law firm. He's scheduled to stand trial in early October, and you look at the calendar, we all know what that is. It's a month before the presidential election. So during the case, the ComEd 4 case, as it was known, Madigan was not on trial, but his presence was a constant in the courtroom. I want to play for you a couple of the key government recordings that were among the most pivotal ones that the prosecutors used to convict. They're a little hard to follow, but the discussions, they're all basically about keeping Madigan happy. And I think, you know, we're going to look at a few of these, but I think these tapes, for an audience like you guys, if you haven't seen them, they're fascinating, because these all were brought together by government moles, people cooperating with the government. Some of them are, you know, during the trial, a lot of them were just recordings, you know, you could pick up on cell phones. But the ones we're going to watch here are ones in which cooperating witnesses secretly recorded people. And they don't talk about how this happens. But on the vantage point, you can see that they're probably like a pen or something like that with a camera. And it's just amazing to watch. The scheme here involving Madigan was, you know, built around making his 13th Ward precinct committeeman happy. And the way that they did that was that they gave lobbying contracts that paid $5,000 a month to these people. And the trade-off was they didn't really have to do any work for that. There's nothing illegal. They were under the guise of lobbying contracts, nothing illegal about lobbying. But the problem here is they weren't lobbying, and they were part of a conspiracy. And so that's what was illegal here. Over time, some of these folks made hundreds of thousands of dollars through this arrangement. I mean, they were being paid basically to knock on doors in the 13th Ward, but they also had this kind of side hustle that was being arranged for them through ComEd. One witness took the stand in the trial, and he had one of these no-work contracts, and he said it was a reward for his hard political work for Madigan. The audio recording we're about to see, I think, is really amazing. Jurors are taken, you can see the title there, Pizza and Bribery. Jurors are taken inside a popular Springfield Italian restaurant. And I saw this table from Springfield. You folks all know Saputo's. And so this is where a lot of state politicians go after hours. Madigan himself was a frequent visitor there when they were in session. He had a habit of, you know, sitting at a side table with his friends. He would almost always order like broiled whitefish. I mean, he was a health nut. And, you know, McLean was often there with him, Mike McLean, the lobbyist with ComEd. This video here we're going to see, there's this informant that filmed it named Fidel Marquez. He worked for ComEd. He was their head of governmental affairs. And he's at a table sharing pizza with McLean McLean is facing the camera, and they're talking about some of the Madigan no work contracts that ComEd had on its books. And it's going to take about a minute to play through here, but listen closely about how they agree not to put anything in writing to ensure that those contracts are hard to find. There's a new CEO coming into ComEd, and they're trying to, they don't know how this new CEO, who was a former federal prosecutor, was going to look on this arrangement. So they were a little bit worried about, let's just keep this down low. And, you know, not putting things into writing, of course, that implies, more than implies, keeping secrets. So if we can play that tape now, let's do that.
And Joe will probably believe that somehow we're plotting against him.
Well, he probably thinks that all the time.
Well, but that's what I mean. I mean, and this will give him another nail in the coffin. So that's why I don't want to do that. So recommend nothing in writing.
I think all that could do is hurt you. There's no way you could, except for giving your biography.
Can I wrap this up for you?
You know what? I'm not going to take it. It's
Are you
fine.
still picking at it?
No, I'm done.
All right.
One more piece.
No, God, no.
It was-
Do you want to take it?
No.
You sure?
He's like, no, please.
It's very good. That's the problem.
I mean, the laughter at the end of the audio is a little jarring, and I'm sorry, it was a little hard to hear McLean talking there, but he's agreeing that let's not put anything in writing here so that, you know, these people that work for Madigan will be discovered. You know, these guys, the laughter, I mean, it's jarring because, you know, they're doing two things. They're talking about ways to perfect the dark art of graft, and then they're also saying, you know, we don't need a to-go box. You know, next, on this next slide, we've got another video from the same trial, and this time it involves Jay Doherty. Jay Doherty, he ran a organization in Chicago called the City Club of Chicago. They would have luncheons at Maggiano's, and a who's who would go there to speak, and so he had a lot of influence. Doherty also lobbied for ComEd. And so here, Marquez, the government mole that we heard talking there, he's talking with Doherty about these same no work contracts to Madigan's allies. And they were being hidden within Doherty's portfolio of lobbying clients. So it was really hard to tell kind of what the arrangement was. I mean, people like me really couldn't understand if we looked at the lobbying records, what was going on here. And certainly state utility regulators had no way of knowing. And so you're going to hear Doherty stress to Marquez how important these deals are to keep Madigan happy. And it's really important for ComEd to, you know, keep its legislative ambitions humming in Springfield. And there's one line in here you should listen for, the title, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Let's go ahead and play that one.
So number one, your money comes from Springfield. ComEd money, right? I mean, for the most part.
You mean that's how we make our money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get ready.
Through our rates, yes.
And, you know, we're me. And again, I'm like Matty is not my best friend, but if I called him right now, he'd call or he'd say, "Jay, if I want to see him, I'd go see him." But my bottom line advice would be, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
You know, it's really fascinating to me. I mean, you look at these folks,
So number one,
they're well dressed. They look like they could be your neighbor, polished. They know the system in and out. They know the players, and they don't think they're doing anything illegal. And what jurors saw in these tapes and others was something completely different. They saw what I think most people would see when you dissect the scheme. It was not proper. Let's look at the next slide here. You know, any of you following the news know that another big corruption trial involved the former Chicago alderman, Ed Burke. He was the longest serving city councilman in Chicago history. He's married to the former Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, Ann Burke. And a federal jury found him guilty of soliciting favors and extorting work for his law firm from people and companies that had business in City Hall. If anyone was regarded as untouchable at City Hall for decades, it was Ed Burke. And that changed when the feds came knocking at his doorstep. This next tape we're going to hear, we can go to the next slide. It's an audio clip that's a little bit longer, or roughly the same as the first one, but a little longer than the second one. We're going to hear another voice of a government informant. This time, it's former Alderman Danny Solis. He secretly recorded Burke a lot of times in his City Hall office. So this is Burke's City Hall office this is happening in. And what they're talking about in this tape is Burke is getting impatient. There's a developer that needs approval for permits in Chicago. Burke is willing to help do the lifting to help this developer get what he needs. But in exchange, he wants the developer to hire his law firm to do property tax appeal work. And there's a reference in this tape that you need to listen to a cash register. And Burke is talking about the cash register having not rung yet. And this is meaning that, you know, what's going on? I'm willing to help this developer, but they haven't signed off on hiring my firm. What's going on? And so listen for that. And look at his facial expression too. Again, it's just kind of the, you know, this normal, everything is legal look on his face. It's one of the more memorable bits of information that prosecutors gave to the jury. It shows Burke abusing his power pretty clearly. And to think that this was happening in his City Hall office, where the work of the people is supposed to be first and foremost on what's going on, not personal enrichment. So go ahead and play this tape too.
The other stuff is working well. CMK on both sides of River City and just north of Roosevelt Road. And I think the post office is they have a lot of other stuff that they're going to need in the future. I don't think the historical landmark issue has been resolved yet either. So.
All right. So far, we had no, the cash register has not rung yet.
All right. I was just confused because the last time you talked to me, I haven't got a contract, and I thought maybe you were talking about something other than the tax work. So maybe you were talking about the lobbying too. So, but you're
Well,
open.
they can hire our firm if they want somebody to lobby Amtrak. That's not a conflict for me.
But you said, but you would still prefer the tax work, right?
Somebody's got to do it. I thought that's what our conversation was.
That's what the conversation was.
Initially, yeah.
You know, I mean, somebody's got to do it. Nobody else in town can do property tax appeal work but Ed Burke. And so these tapes, you know, they got some exposure. I mean, if you were watching the news, you would see clips of them. But I just think, you know, for a group like yours, they're just so telling, because this is what, you know, the federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, FBI, what they are busy accumulating on these folks as really kind of the last line of accountability for folks in Springfield. And in each case, the jury looked at these tapes and pretty much they were slam dunk convictions. So, you know, to move on our next slide.
The other stuff is.
There have been other notable corruption convictions here in the last year. One involved former Madigan Chief of Staff Tim Mapes, who was convicted of repeatedly lying to the FBI as basically part of an effort to stymie the investigation into Madigan. Earlier this month, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. The other case involved lobbyist James Weiss. He is the son-in-law of the former Cook County assessor Joe Barrios. He was convicted of bribing 2 Illinois lawmakers and lying to the FBI to enhance his own personal business interests, and was sentenced to 5.5 years. So 2 other big political corruption cases on top of ComEd. So we want to move along to the next slide. Now, there's one thing to watch here in relation to some of these cases, and that's a U.S. Supreme Court case right now. It involves a former Northwest Indiana mayor convicted of bribery. And it was a case that the Supreme Court decided to hear in December, and it involved the former mayor of Portage, Indiana, a guy named James Snyder. He accepted cash from a city contractor after signing off on a government contract for this company. And the lawyers for Snyder argue that there was no quid pro quo here because he got money after the awards were granted. So that, usually we think of a bribe happening just the opposite. I give you money and then I expect you as a public official to do what I want. It's the other way around. And so the court is going to look at that. And what's important here for the ComEd case and for Madigan is that similar questions apply to them. Their defense lawyers argue that, they didn't have, they weren't offered bundles of cash in exchange for official action. And it'll be interesting to see how the court responds to that. Already there's been a ripple effect here in Illinois with that. The ComEd 4, they were supposed to be sentenced in January, but they persuaded the judge in their case to, at least postpone it. We don't know yet when they're going to be sentenced. The Madigan trial, that was due to start in April. They convinced the judge to put it off until October to see how the high court ruled on this. So it's going to be important to watch because if, it could be that some of these charges or convictions get set aside in these cases. Which I know. This is all layered on top of Rod. And Rod Blagojevich, I think he's going to be remembered as one of the corruption kingpins of state history. It's hard to avoid. I mean, he was convicted, of course, as we all know, of trying to sell Barack Obama's open Senate seat. He was convicted of extorting a children's hospital executive, a racetrack operator, and to lying for the FBI. So, I mean, he ran the gamut as far as illegality. I covered his election in 2002, and he ran as a government reformer. He was coming out of the George Ryan controversy and was promising voters he was going to be so much different. And yet we saw something entirely, what we're accustomed to. I covered his impeachment and the ouster from office, and we know that Donald Trump let him out of prison early. But among the memories of covering Blagojevich, there's one that I wanted to share with you from his last day as governor. It was on the day of the impeachment vote. And so I was sitting in the state Senate, and this front page on the Sun-Times relates to the story. I was sitting in the Senate, and he had gone in there to give a speech before the vote. And he thought that he could persuade senators to not, drive him out of office. And, he gives his speech and then leaves. And I'm sitting in the press box along with other reporters, and we're thinking, well, we would like to get, some last few words from him outside of here. But the problem was when, nobody knew where he had gone. And I had left the Senate chamber, and I was trying to figure out which exit is he going to go out. And finally, I find a security guard in the building that I knew, and I'm like, where is Rod? And the guy had a walkie-talkie, and he knew, where the detail was taking Rod. And there's an underground tunnel system that connects the state capitol to all the buildings on the government campus there. And he had taken this underground tunnel, and it led out across the street. And this guard told me, if you go over there, you'll catch it. And so, here it is, late January. I just had kind of this coat on. It was freezing out, and so I'm just like, I run over there, and I can tell that, I'm in the right spot because there's a waiting Chevy Suburban there. It's running. And, by the time I get there, Rod then he comes out of the tunnel, and I have time for like one question. And he comes out, and I'm like, Governor, don't you feel like you ought to tell Illinoisans you're sorry for everything you put them through? He looks at me, he walks to his car, opens the door, and then he's just like, sorry for what? And, it just kind of like, it was the perfect headline for the paper. And that's what went on the paper the next day. But it just goes to show you that, like, there's no contrition. And that's the case to this day with him. This up here is a slide. I just thought while we're talking Blagojevich, I'd give a plug for the podcast here that I did. It's called Public Official A. And if any of you are interested kind of in the story of Rod Blagojevich himself, we all know the story, but what we tried to do here was talk to the key players in the case. We talked to, Rod was in prison when we did this, but I think I had 8 hours of interview time with Patty Blagojevich, which was, quite a trip. We talked to FBI agents who were involved in the surveillance, the arrests. We talked to a former top prosecutor. We talked to Rod's close associates, and we talked to one of the cooperating early government witnesses in this case. And she had a recording device, wait for this, attached to her bra. And that was the she was so paranoid when she went into it was a breakfast meeting at Oak Brook Center with some of the people that she was trying to get on tape. And she was just constantly worried that, anytime she was going to move, it was either going to come out or move, but she was really a fun interview. And a colorful person. She ran Edward Hospital in Naperville for a number of years. So I again, if you're interested in listening to that, it's available where you can find your podcasts. And another quick thing, Jake Tapper with CNN debuted a new series called The United States of Scandal. And I don't know if any of you folks have seen this or not, but it's actually very good. They debuted it last Sunday, and the first episode was on Blagojevich. I'm in it. Carol Marine, my friend, she's in it. There's some others, and Rod sat down with Tapper as well, and he let the production crew kind of mess with his hair, and that caught my eye initially because given how Rod was so focused on his hair, Rod in the interview compared himself humbly to Abraham Lincoln, and and then he also doubled down on that exchange that we talked about in the previous slide. Tapper asked him, about, that question I asked him about, aren't you sorry? And Rod, to this day, no apologies necessary. So in less than 20 years' time, we've had federal corruption investigations send Blagojevich and Republican predecessor George Ryan to federal prison. And you add to that all the trials that we've talked about prior to that, and it's just a lot for corruption-weary Illinoisans to digest. Through my reporting, I've noted how corruption can carry genuine costs, both in voter sentiment and in the way that government operates and how it spends money. On this next slide, we're going to see a little closer look at that. On the left of this are results from a poll that the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute in SIU Carbondale did. It was back in 2012, so it's a little dated, but I think the results are probably still pretty close to accurate. Right after Rod was convicted, and they posed the question of how widespread do you think corruption is in Illinois state government? And 77% of people thought it was widespread. And then they also asked people, how do you think Illinois with its corruption compares to other states? And nearly 60% thought that we had more here than in other states. So that gives you an idea that this misconduct is really kind of permeating our culture here in our society. People know it exists and they're not happy with it. Now, on the right side of this, let's talk dollars and cents. In 2014, this didn't get really any coverage, but I stumbled across it when I was doing reporting on this corruption piece I did. Indiana University and the City University of Hong Kong did a study in 2014 where they analyzed that Justice Department data that was on one of those early slides of public corruption convictions. And they looked at the 10 most corrupt states based on that conviction data. Illinois was one of them. And they analyzed government spending in those states versus everybody else. And what they found was that the average government expenditure per capita was about $1,300 higher in the most corrupt states than elsewhere. So in effect, we're all paying a corruption tax, and we don't realize it. It's there. And the theory behind that higher spending is that the emphasis in these high corruption states is on bribe generating spending. And that means, things like construction projects or borrowing costs or what people are paid in salaries. And they're things that, also could result in campaign contributions or some of the various side hustles like we've seen happen, with Burke and others. So that's the cost of it. On the next slide, I guess you could maybe see a little bit of a silver lining here because the idea that government misconduct, as bad as it is, as soured as we all are by it, it hasn't appeared to dampen voter participation. And I think that's really good news. There was a research report that I found that analyzed, or it looked at how in Mexico, where corruption is more rampant than it is here, it looked at how people voted there in highly corrupt areas. And what it found was that people didn't vote because they just were throwing their arms up and saying, my vote doesn't matter. And I think what we found here, I went back and I looked at voter registration numbers, ballots cast, and that's not the case here. In presidential elections, on that graphic you can see the amount of ballots cast in Illinois between 2000 and 2020 grew by more than 20%. And in off-year gubernatorial cycles, the growth was 13%. And what you compare that to is our growth as a state population-wise, and that's about 3%. So it's not like these numbers are a result of more people flooding into the state. So it demonstrates, I think, that people are turned off by corruption, but they're still going to the polls in a very robust way. And Becky Simon, I thought, added really good insights into why that was, that people see voting as a way to hold people accountable, and they're doing that. So let's shift gears a little bit here. There we have Rod again. I think I'm in the background there. This is at the Dirksen Federal Building. It was after his first trial when he was convicted on only one count. The rest were hung jury. He came out and talked. But the role that journalists play in uncovering government corruption, it's really important. Journalists keep a vigilant watch over our governments, a free press, and I stress a nonpartisan press. That's so important because I don't know, people in here, if you live in communities that don't have functioning local papers, you might see, these newspapers at Starbucks, or you see them in election years. They look like newspapers, but they're not. And there's a name for them. Pink slime is what they're called. And they're completely one-sided. And that's not what journalism is. Journalism is balance. You give both sides, whether, my job is not to agree or disagree, but I quote Republicans as much as I quote Democrats, because I think that's important for people, for voters to understand what's going on in our country. So the slide up here talks a little bit about what reporters do. We use open records laws to monitor spending and policymaking. We investigate malfeasance and misspending. We educate voters about elections. And on the open records part, I just want to give you kind of a flavor of how that works, because I don't know anybody in this room. Is there anybody, a show of hands, who has written a Freedom of Information request? So a few of you have. I mean, everybody in this room can do it, and it's actually in your communities. It's a good way to keep tabs on what your government is doing. What's the police overtime budget look like? What are the borrowing costs? Who's making fees off of the government borrowing? You can do all sorts of things like that. And our laws in Illinois for freedom of information, thankfully, are pretty strong. One of the things that we do at WBEZ frequently with open records laws is we send them out to all sorts of government agencies asking for criminal subpoenas. And those are important because it helps us keep tabs on who or what is being investigated by either counties or by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And one example of that is in 2019, there was a raid at the Capitol of a state senator's office, State Senator Marty Sandoval. He was a Democrat from Cicero. He's no longer with us now. He passed away. But the FBI went in, they executed a search warrant, and they took a whole bunch of stuff out of his office. And so what we went to do after we learned about this, sent in a FOIA request to the Secretary of the Senate. And we asked for a copy of the subpoena. We asked for a copy of the federal search warrant. And then we asked for the roster of what was taken out. All of these things that the federal government presented to the Secretary of the Senate. The Senate president at that time, John Cullerton, he controlled the process there. He tried to limit our access to some of that, but our attorneys pushed back. And what we wound up getting, it gave us a very early glimpse into the ComEd investigation, because they were looking for records in there related to ComEd and Exelon, which we at the time didn't really understand what that was about. But there were other things too that Sandoval was involved in, the red light cameras, other things that they were in there looking for. And it led to valuable, really valuable reporting threads for us to look at. Roughly a decade ago, the same thing happened with Blagojevich. I mean, his office was raided, but we kept sending these FOIA requests in for the subpoenas. And what we would get back is, we have them, but we're not going to show them to you. And what I still look back at this, and I think it's kind of funny. The reason that they gave us that they would not give us criminal subpoenas that they were receiving was that they didn't want to interfere with a government investigation. And the irony is, I mean, that investigation was into them. So they weren't doing the government any favors. A state appeals court ultimately sided with reporters, though, in a really important decision that established that these subpoenas are public documents and subject to FOIA. More recently, just to tie this up, WBEZ had a back and forth with the Illinois State Toll Highway Authority about this very issue. With these transponders now, the iPass, investigators use the data that gets collected off the iPass for a number of reasons. Sometimes they're investigating movements of people. And so we've FOIA'd for that information. And we sometimes get it, we sometimes don't, but we sent them a list or a FOIA request for subpoenas. And what they gave us back were subpoenas that didn't have anybody's names on them. They were blacked out. And it's like, well, all right, what good is that? Like, what are you actually telling me that you're getting a subpoena, but we can't see who it's for? So we took them to court and prevailed on that, thankfully. A judge in Cook County ruled that, they can't redact the names of people off of these criminal subpoenas, the public records. So that gives a flavor of, like, the fight with these FOIA laws is you got to preserve them. You can't let them be eroded, because that is the tendency of governments, because sometimes they don't want to share information like this. It's sensitive or it's politically painful for somebody, but yet these are our documents and we're entitled to see them. The next part here, the fourth estate and its decline. In the United States, the term the fourth estate is used to place the press alongside the three other branches of government: judicial, legislative, and executive. And it's a term that refers to the watchdog role of the press. And it shows that it's essential to a functioning democracy. But industry-wide, journalism, as we all know, in our communities, is struggling to fulfill that mission because of a lot of forces outside of its control. One thing we've heard repeatedly is how anti-democratic with a small d, political candidates and office holders have undermined faith in news outlets whose duty is to hold public officials accountable. I don't feel like an enemy of the people. I mean, I feel like I am part of that, part of the people, and a more immediate and potentially fatal problem than kind of that bad mouthing is the changing economics that has been happening really since the internet took hold. The internet, other technological advances, they've fundamentally changed how we consume news. And I don't know, probably, I like the show of hands thing. How many people here get a print newspaper? Holy cow, that is impressive. Well, I think you get two of them. That's excellent. Two of them. Well, I still get print newspapers, but I think I'm like a growing number of people. I get my news on my phone now. And that's it's changed a lot of things. I mean, broadcast news, newspaper audiences, they migrated there to the internet. And that's caused massive declines in ratings and subscriptions. Advertisers, the lifeblood of newspapers, they've targeted online things like digital platforms to advertise in. Technology companies have resisted paying the journalism industry for content, and they lobby to block legislation that attempts to fairly compensate publishers and broadcasters for the use of content. When I started in journalism in the mid '80s, it was not uncommon for newspapers to have 20% or greater profit margins. They were highly lucrative, and right now that's not the case. It's red ink everywhere you look, and these places are being bought up by hedge funds. The business model with the hedge funds is to slash jobs and to sell property. I mean, it used to be every community that had a newspaper typically would have a newspaper office somewhere near City Hall, because the reason you had a City Hall reporter who needed quick access, to be able to get back and file stories. And these properties now have just one by one been sold because they're downtown properties. And if you go into Chicago and you're on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, you can see how that's happened. The place where I used to work, the Sun-Times, that property was sold out from underneath the newspaper to Donald Trump, and he knocked the building down and built a high-rise there. And then the Tribune Tower, they were bought by Alden Capital, and this beautiful building that there was a contest to design it, and the building, we all know outside, the famous pieces of Moon Rock and the Alamo and all those things and it was a beautiful building with so much history. It's been gutted and replaced by luxurious condominiums. They're selling for $1 million and up. And meanwhile, the Tribune is now, they've got offices in their printing center, which is about to be sold to make way for the Bally's Casino. So you can just see, it's like, this was the world's greatest newspaper. It built itself that way. And this is what it has become. Nationally, the journalism sector has eliminated roughly 2,700 jobs in 2023 alone, and more layoffs have been announced for this year already. Newspapers across the country are contracting and in some places closing. And what's happening is we're getting news deserts popping up all over the place. In the next slide here, if you look at that map closely, it's a little small, but those white sections there are counties in Illinois that don't have a single news outlet. And so you have towns there that are not being covered in any shape at all. And the light gray shade there, those are communities, roughly 36 of them, that have only one source of news available to them. And so what you have here is basically a third of Illinois that doesn't have ready access to reliable or plentiful news sources in their communities. And this map here was put together by Northwestern University. They have a project called the State of Local News, and they're monitoring what is happening to our local news landscape. As part of my look into the Fourth Estate as well here, I went to the website of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They keep track of the number of jobs that there are in states, and I looked up journalism. And in Illinois in 2000, there were 3,030 journalists in the state, and people who chronicled local city council and school board meetings, people who covered high school football games, people who marked the highs and lows of communities. I remember, like, when I worked at the Daily Herald, I wrote a story about the birth of a 15-pound baby. I mean, things like that. Those are what bind us together as a community. News in our community. Well, by 2022, that number, 3,030, had shrunk, and just 2 years ago, we had 900 working journalists in the state of Illinois. A state that has 13 million people, 900 journalists. A state task force was convened as a result of legislation signed by J.B. Pritzker that has been studying this problem. And they recently came out with a series of proposed tax policy changes that are designed to help financially struggling news outlets. One of the ideas would give tax credits for news outlets. If you buy an advertisement, you would get a tax credit for that. If a news outlet hires a reporter or an editor, they would get a tax credit for that. And so those are changes that would require legislative approval. Given all this financial upheaval, it's not surprising that there have been big changes to Illinois' media landscape. I mentioned Alden Capital. They've gutted the Tribune. There were 111 positions in June of 2021 at the Chicago Tribune. That's down to 76 now. The union that represents Chicago Tribune employees held a one-day work stoppage at the end of January because these folks working there have not gotten raises since 2018. Job losses also have affected coverage at the state capitol. A 2014 study by Pew found that the size of the Illinois State House Reporting Corps had dropped dramatically over a 5-year period, and that it marked the sharpest decline anywhere in the country. When I had an office in the Capitol Press Room, and I was there between 1995 and 2014, early on, there were newspapers from places like Rockford, Alton, Peoria, Kankakee, St. Louis, Champaign. They were closed since then. They had reporters there that they just aren't there anymore. But I will tell you that there have been some good developments that have happened there. One of them involves a group called Capital News Illinois. They're funded by the Illinois Press Foundation, the McCormick Foundation, the Illinois Broadcasters Foundation. And they've got a crew of 7 full-time journalists that work in 5 Illinois counties, the capital included, and they're unbiased, credible, resourced. They do good work, and you can look them up on the internet, and I would encourage you to do that. Charitable foundations and partnerships, nonprofits have stepped up in other ways. In 2021, ProPublica, they're an independent nonprofit newsroom focused on investigative journalism. They built a Midwestern regional news hub in Chicago. Also in 2021, the Better Government Association and McCormick Foundation formed the Illinois Solutions Partnership, another nonprofit investigative solution-based journalism endeavor. In 2022, my employer, WBEZ, acquired the Sun-Times, and we'll talk about that in a moment here on the next slide. But by and large, I mean, nonprofit, nonpartisan news is managing to kind of break the trend a little bit of the for-profit model where just jobs are being cut left and right. And it's given hope a little bit to the Fourth Estate that there is at least a revenue stream here for the moment to keep news coming out of the places where we need it. The Chicago Public Media partnership that I talked about is a really cool thing, and I'm privileged to be part of it. It's an interesting moment in Chicago journalism. The paper, the Sun-Times, I worked there from 95, from 95 until 2014. It's been a chronic thing with them about whether they were going to be able to survive, because the Tribune was always the dominant paper, but it was just kind of this scrappy thing that would never go away. And that's what I loved about it. It kind of, the Sun-Times sort of had a chip on its shoulder and managed to just defy gravity. And, the idea that it was a paper that had, just a bunch of, terrible owners even, in the late 90s, it was bought by Conrad Black. I don't know how many people know Conrad Black, but he was this, he wasn't royalty, but he was a noble from England, and he bought up journalism properties in Canada and the US, and decided to pick the Sun-Times, and he would write these columns under the byline, Lord Black of Cross Harbor. And it was like, I don't know any Lord Blacks of Cross Harbor in Chicago, but he was one of them. Well, he and the news executives at that time, they were skimming money off of the property. They, when that money should have been being reinvested, they were pocketing it, and they wound up, Black wound up going to prison. He was pardoned by Donald Trump. There was a point, while they were pocketing money there, part of the cuts they did at the Sun-Times in the old building, we used to have escalators that would move people up and down. They turned them off to save on the power bill, and it's like, seriously. So anyway, the Sun-Times, we know the history there has been turbulent. But when Chicago Public Media acquired the paper, private foundations agreed to commit $61 million over 5 years to help keep operations at the Sun-Times going. And so the newspaper converted from a for-profit model to a nonprofit. And it now functions alongside WBEZ under the umbrella of Chicago Public Media. And with 300 combined employees, roughly, in the two news organizations, the Institute for Nonprofit News identified us as the largest nonprofit newsroom in the country. Our combination, is it distributes news across the state, and so that's really a positive thing. And I can show you real quickly. We'll move along here because we're getting close on time. The Chicago Public Media Organization launched with the University of Chicago's Center for Effective Government this Democracy Solutions Project. And what we're trying to do is, basically talk about the threats facing democracy, how Americans can become more civically engaged, what are some of the barriers to voting, polarization, misinformation, corruption. Those are all topics that we're covering. And these are going to be available on BEZ and the Sun-Times and the places where we circulate. The next slide will show you some of the work that's already been done on federal elections. The slide after that will show you on topics that are important to democracy and corruption in Illinois. And, just to close here, I wanted to, just kind of summarize that, we live in a place where corruption flourishes, and it's everywhere. Investigations and trials are happening left and right, and the people coming, being affected by this, the former House Speaker Ed Burke, these are people who had so much influence in our government. We know that there are people being turned off by this. We know that there is a cost to it, and the silver lining is that voting still seems to be happening in a good way. I want to refer very quickly back to when Blagojevich was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The judge in his case, the late James Zagel, had some thought-provoking words that I just want to leave you with. He told Blagojevich, "When it's the governor who goes bad, the fabric of Illinois is torn and disfigured and not easily or quickly repaired." I mean, that's what corruption does to us. And then the judge also said something I think that pertains to the rest of us. He said to Blagojevich, "Your case is another maxim that the American people always get precisely the government that they deserve." Now think about that for a minute. That is a call to voters. You've got to be on top of your game, pay attention, and participate. So anyway, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. The Center for Effective Government couldn't be here today, but I'm going to just sort of buzz through a couple of their slides so you're also aware of some of the very interesting things that they are doing. As Dave said, voters defend democracy, but philanthropy and academia also play a role. You should know that since 2021, over 250 individual and institutional grant makers have supported over 2,000 grantees with over $1 billion in grant making that revitalizes our democracy. And then this university Center for Effective Government, they're a partner in the Democracy Solutions project, excuse me. And they have 3 goals, and I'm going to focus on their 3 areas: ideas, education, and engagement. They have 5 avenues through which to share ideas. They have a scholar practitioner conference, academic research grants to faculty in the reform space. Their data in democracy is really interesting because U of C is strong in their technology end, and they can combine political and data science to generate findings necessary to protect democracy in the digital age. They have an American Politics conference, and they also host a Not Another Politics podcast where they share political science research. Education is another critical focus area. They have a leadership development program, and they have an annual cohort of 30 Civic Leadership Academy fellows. The goal is to generate a pipeline of leaders who can best leverage reforms. And I encourage league members to apply, especially in the Chicago League. Applications for the 2025 cohort will open in early summer this year. Last, engagement brings people together to advance reform. And so they have a lot of these interconnected partnerships. Of course, Democracy Solutions Project is one, but they do Reimagine Chicago is a joint series with WBEZ's Reset. One City, 50 Wards is a partnership between the center and Crane Chicago Business. The Democracy series, this will be interesting for those of you in the leagues that have book clubs, but this is a series that features discussions with authors of books on the state of democracy, not just in the United States, but abroad, because democracy is on the decline worldwide. Rethinking Our Democracy features reform essays in the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog. And last, the Democracy Fellowship is an annual non-residential program that brings democracy scholars everywhere. These are questions for Dave. How do we get the word out about partisan publications like the DuPage Policy Journal and these local papers that publish their articles?
You know, one thing I guess I would recommend is the places you go to where you see this, it might be worth asking the shop owner, like, why do you let this in here? Show them what the paper does. And it's, it may be, and again, I'm not picking sides here, but the people who are quoted in that are all Republicans, and that's not Republicans need to have their voice out, but Democrats and independents and Republicans are part of our landscape in democracy. Take the paper and show the owner why is this just one side, and owners will respond if customers are unhappy. I would do that.
Why did the Supreme Court agree to hear the bribery case?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I think, and it'll be an interesting thing. They have until June to decide what they're going to do with this. So all of these cases that I mentioned are kind of, well, at least a couple of them are going to be on hold, I think, until at least maybe June.
What suggestions do you have to keep the corruption stories in the public consciousness? Why is this important to reinforce stories for the public?
Well, I mean, we're all paying taxes and we all want that money to be spent responsibly. And that's the bottom line. That's the lifeblood of our government, because for every dollar that's going into somebody's pocket, it could go to fill a pothole, or it could go to, buy a social worker and pay her salary or his salary. And so that's why corruption is a corrosive thing. And it happens when people are not watching. And, if we don't, newspapers and media that cover local meetings, they're important, but it's just as important to go to those meetings, because, if you don't have a reporter there watching it, if you go, you're another set of eyes and ears, and you have the capacity as a citizen. If you see something, like they say something. And that, you can call your local reporter, whoever that is, wherever that person is, and fill them in on it.
Do you think that the future of print journalism is the Sun-Times model of going not for profit? Is that the future of journalism nationwide?
I think it's one promising alternative, because I look at the New York Times. I think they have managed to do so many things right there, but it's a family-owned newspaper, and it's safely run, I think, as long as that family continues running it. But I think where our problem happens is when these out-of-town entities come into play, hedge funds. They are just there's no, they lose sight of what the mission is of these publications. They lose sight that they're supposed to be, rooted in a community, and so I think that's the concern right there.
The Illinois General Assembly established a task force to discuss news. Do you know of any findings or actions on this to date?
Well, they focused, as I mentioned, on tax policy ideas. And what I'm concerned about is, in Springfield, whenever a task force is created anywhere, the findings come out, they sit on a shelf, they gather dust. And so there's a state senator who's a former broadcast journalist in Rockford, Steve Stottleman, who was behind this. And, it's going to be up to him and people alongside him to keep this in the next 2 or 3 months on the agenda. So far, I've not, I know the group has published its findings, but the key is, getting the legislative leaders engaged, getting the governor engaged. And so far, I've heard a lot of crickets.
It is my impression that Illinois is one, if not the most corrupt state historically. Is that correct? And if so, what has created and maintained that culture of corruption?
Well, it certainly is one of the most corrupt states. I mean, you'd have to include, Louisiana. They've got a record there as well. But it just becomes kind of embedded in our the way we do things. Like, I mean, I can think of like political organizations. Look at the way they work. I mean, we have so many kind of multi-generational political families, and it becomes kind of a, it almost becomes kind of a club where, or if you're not part of the family, you're not part of it. And that's not the way democracy works. It's like everybody, we're all in this together, and our voices all should be heard. And so I think, that's a problem. That we also have a very aggressive U.S. Attorney's Office. That makes a big difference too.
Could people be voting more today due to mail-in ballots?
Oh, they could be voting today for a number of reasons. Absolutely. And I think Illinois, unlike other states, has done a lot to enhance ballot access over the last 10 or 15 years.
How do you protect yourself from becoming a cynic when you see so much corruption?
Yeah, you know what though? It's like, I can't stress enough, like if any of you have time, go to one of these trials. They are open. And it's just, you sit there and you watch the system working the way it's designed to work. It's like, you may not see humility if you walk inside the state capitol, where people sometimes think they're untouchable. Not always, but like, we've seen a Madigan, for example. You get enough power. It's like nobody can question you. But you go into a courtroom like that, and suddenly somebody like that is on trial, or somebody with a lot of power, they're being brought to account. And you see prosecutors, and you see FBI agents, and you understand the amount of work that is involved in following our laws and finding out information and bringing it to a jury of our peers. The system really is working the way it's supposed to. And you're in that courtroom watching it. And I get kind of, I get warm and gooey when I watch these things, because it's like, this is the way it's supposed to work.
Okay. So we have time for a couple more. What can we do to open state and federal courts to video?
Oh, I would love to know the answer to that, because that I think is a really important educational question. We all know corruption's a problem, but if we can't watch, nobody could tune on. These videos we showed, they were not generally available to people, and so if you can't see testimony in courtrooms, it's a problem, because we're not, we're depriving people of that accountability and the way that, people being held to account. They should be in courtrooms.
I'm sorry, we still have so many more questions, but I do have to move on just because of the other presentation. So please forgive us, but we can collect the questions and try and get them answered later. Sorry about that. So we're going to move on. My name is Donna Limper. I'm the ethics specialist for the League of Women Voters of Illinois. And I want to talk a little bit about the accountability bills that the League will support in the spring session. Illinois HB 3582 and HB 2892 are separate Republican and Democratic bills, respectively, that ask for essentially the same thing: a truly independent legislative inspector general. A little background. Both the Legislative Ethics Commission and Legislative Inspector General oversee legislator conduct in Illinois. However, the Legislative Ethics Commission is composed almost entirely of active lawmakers, the very same people the commission should hold accountable. The commission also governs the investigations of the Legislative Inspector General. Illinois' Legislative Inspector General lacks the independent subpoena power and publishing power shared by its state peers. This lack allows the commission to render Illinois' legislative watchdog ineffectual. They have the power to suppress an investigation at the front end or deny reporting of the findings at the back end. Both bills reform statute to allow the legislative inspector general to issue a subpoena. That's the first bullet point, which is in both the Republican and Democratic bill, and publish its findings. That's the second bullet point. Again, that point is in both bills, without requiring advance approval from the Legislative Ethics Commission. The Democratic bill goes one step further and requires the Legislative Ethics Commission to appoint at least one commissioner from the general public. That's the third bullet point. The League of Women Voters promotes an open governmental system that is representative, accountable, and responsive. Therefore, the League supports the following basic elements in a full statute. An independent reporting structure. The LIG should not be reporting directly or solely to the legislature. Alyssa Kaplan of Reform for Illinois has termed the present structure the fox watching the henhouse. Protection of the budget. A funding floor protects the office from possible reprisals. Protection of the legislative inspector general, him or herself. The legislative inspector general can only be removed for cause. A cooperation agreement. The ability to issue and enforce subpoenas and publish findings is critically important. Again, that's in both bills. A public check and balance. Placing members of the public on the Legislative Ethics Commission would make the process more transparent and accountable. That's in the Democratic bill. The League will be undertaking a campaign to advocate for a consolidated bill with all three elements that both parties can support in the 2024 spring session. The timing is right for the League and its partners to lead a charge to create a truly independent legislative inspector general office. Scandal is ethics legislation's best friend. And as Dave has described, scandals are in the news. Public pressure is most effective in election years. If a significant number of voters tell incumbents and challengers that they expect ethics reform, lawmakers would feel the pressure and in turn apply it to their party leaders. Most importantly, that pressure must be bipartisan. The League of Women Voters of Illinois, with its 41 leagues, many of here today, spread across 16 populated counties, is uniquely positioned to apply that pressure. We've put together a resource kit for the League's 4,000 members. There's a fact sheet and a list of current sponsors. We will work to engage all member organizations of the Just Democracy Coalition to expand demand for reform. Our action plan centers on lawmaker contact and letters to the editor. President Becky Simon has already sent an email to the bill's sponsors and ethics committee chairs with our ask, a bipartisan bill with out of committee for a full floor vote in the spring session that includes legislative inspector general best practices. Our press release with the ask has already been picked up. We will send talking points to help you contact your representatives, ethics committee members, and the governor. The talking points can also be used to craft letters to the editor. Look for an action alert shortly. Representative, accountable, and responsive government can be restored with good laws, strong enforcement, and public engagement. I'm going to turn it over to Laura. She'll talk about our transparency bills.
Thank you. I'm Laura Davis, and I'm with the issue specialist for criminal justice. And thank you very much, Dave. I would like to also throw in a little plug for all of us who participate in observing, because that makes all of us even local journalists. And we share it with our friends and our families and our neighbors, and that's important. And they know we're in the room. So thank you. I want to talk about a bill that's been worked on for 2 years, actually. It's the Better Government Association and the Court Transparency Coalition of Illinois, of which the League of Women Voters Illinois is a member, are working to get the FOIA, we talked about earlier, of the judicial branch passed as a law. It's currently HB 4292. Currently, judicial records in Illinois are not subject to the state's Freedom of Information Act. Illinois is an outlier among states, where 44 states allow courts to be FOIA. The bill has been worked on for over 2 years and refiled this year, refiled this year with minor adjustment. Still, it can't get moved out of the executive committee into the judiciary where we want to have a hearing. And it's quite a challenge. The league's position, thank you, is criminal justice position states that efficient data collection, analysis, data sharing among appropriate agencies, and transparency are critical in an impartial and unbiased criminal justice system. This act would bring Illinois courts under the same public record standards as other branches of government. Illinois is one of only 6 states that lack access to the judiciary through some kind of public records law or a rule from the state Supreme Court. The recently passed Safety Act, the major criminal justice reform bill that went into effect on September 18th, 2023, one of the requirements of the act is data collection. Data could include things like, how do the courts spend public funds? How long does it take for a court case to move through the system in each county? How is discipline handled at temporary juvenile detention centers? How about details about pretrial supervision or electronic monitoring programs? And how many people violate their terms of pretrial release or probation? Next one, please. So right now we have Representative Curtis Tarver is the lead sponsor in the House. And just this week, Senator Mark Witt sponsored the bill in the Senate. The main goal, as I stated, is really to get it out of the executive committee and into the judiciary committee so that we can have a hearing. It's going to be very difficult to meet the requirements of the Safety Act without getting data that's needed. Additionally, from a budgetary perspective, it would be helpful to know where money is being spent and what outcomes are, say regarding court services, prison, or juvenile detention centers, how much it costs the courts to move a criminal trial through the system. It's tough to make effective changes if you don't have the data. One example for those of us that get the printed newspaper may have read recently about the juvenile detention centers. It was just such a horrible story. So data was requested and several centers replied they did not have to comply because they're exempted from FOIA. So this is where children are kept. Some questions might be, are chemical restraints being used? And if so, what kind? How long are children put in solitary confinement? Are inspections being done? And what are the results? Requests for action, we had hoped were going to come out in the next few weeks, but if or when they do, I hope that you'll all take action. Thank you.